Awesome. Thank you, Carrie. And good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for those of you joining from the West Coast. I know we've got a big group with us today, and we're excited to share with you the outlook for the industry. We've got a little bit of backward looking at how we ended up 2024, but we want to share with you what we're seeing for the rest of 2025 and the 5 years forward, some of the headwinds, tailwinds that we're seeing as part of that forecast as well. So I am going to introduce John Gray. Many of you have seen or know John. He is the principal at Rockport Analytics, and he serves as the Chief Economic Advisor for the ACEC Research Institute. And so we are happy to have him here with us today to share the report. The study just came out. We previewed some of it at the fall conference 2 weeks ago. For those of you who were with us in San Diego, we're going to dive a little bit deeper today than we had time for during that session. But John, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to get us started. I'll keep an eye on the Q&A and jump in where I see some questions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Daphne, and welcome everyone. Excited to be with you all here today. As Daphne noted, we're going to be taking you through the outlook, the forecast, as well as kind of a little bit of backwards-looking data as to how the engineering and design services industry performed last year. We should have plenty of time at the end for some Q&A. As Daphne mentioned, she'll be tracking some questions. So if you have them, please feel free to enter those into that Q&A box as they arise. We can address them sort of throughout, or we should have some time here at the end. I'd like to start before we get into the industry outlook and looking at how the industry performed last year, and just talking a little bit about the macroeconomic environment. And specifically, I want to look at some of the macro trends that we're seeing that we think support or that will drive the engineering and design services industry over the next couple of years. So I think it's important context for us to start with. The first thing that we look at when we're trying to understand the macroeconomic environment are a couple of fundamental statistics. We look at economic growth. So you can see on this slide here, the chart on the left shows quarterly GDP growth over time in the US, of course. And then we're also looking at the change in total US employment on the right-hand side. And so both of these charts go all the way back to 2021. So this is obviously the period coming out or just coming out of the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So you can see, if you look at the GDP slide in 2021, we obviously had tremendous growth. This growth is coming from a very low base as we're coming off the shutdown from 2020. And you can see that growth extended over into 2022. And then, surprising to us, the growth just continued. 23 and 24 were years that we, along with many other economists out there, were warning of recession and a slowdown. And as you can see, that slowdown didn't happen. So 2023, we saw nearly 3% growth. Again, nearly 3% growth in 2024. And then if you look at 2025, we are seeing economic growth moderate. So we're expecting about 2% growth this year. I'll talk about some of the headwinds that we're seeing and some of the reasons why we expect growth to slow this year. And we expect growth to remain a little bit more subdued into 2026. So you can see there 2.2% in GDP growth expected in 2026. If you look at the employment chart on the right-hand side, you'll see somewhat of a similar trend in that all of this is positive. Again, in 2021, we had a tremendous amount of employment growth. And so what this chart is showing is the monthly change in total employment. And so these are the jobs that are added or lost to the US economy each month over this period of time. And quite clearly, we didn't experience losses. And in fact, we experienced really large gains. You can see that in 21, 22. Again, these gains were really making up for some of the losses that we saw during the pandemic in 2020. But those gains continued through 23, 24, and into 2025. But what you can clearly see here in both of these charts, I think, is moderation. And so the backdrop that we have for the industry right now is that economic growth is still very strong. The US economy performing very well across most macroeconomic measures that we follow, but we are starting to see some moderation, right? Why are we seeing moderation? Well, a couple of reasons, but I think the biggest one in 2025 and into 2026 is some of the uncertainty that we see here around trade. As we all know now, tariffs that were first introduced back on Liberation Day. You can see this chart on the left. I think this is really interesting, to look at in terms of measuring overall sentiment about economic policy. This is the Global Economic Policy Uncertainty Index, and a number of professors from 3 different universities have compiled this index to try and gain a measure over time of how much economic uncertainty exists around the world. And you can see a couple of things in this. The first is that trend has been on an upward slope since the measurements began. And so we've seen more and more economic uncertainty over the last few years. But I think what is glaring here is what's called out on the chart, that Liberation Day, that April 2025 high, right? The day that the Trump administration came out to the media with their big boards that said, these are the tariff rates that are going to be imposed on different countries around the world. And it was a big shock, right? We expected that there were going to be tariffs, but not to the degree that were announced on Liberation Day. Since that day, a lot of that has been rolled back. We've seen negotiation. We've seen, 2 steps forward, 1 step back with respect to some of these negotiations. But things have cooled, and you can see that in this index. The index has come back down, still remaining elevated, but less uncertainty than we had back in April. And this is really important because these tariffs, in a couple of different ways, are impacting the macroeconomic environment in the U.S. They're going to impact economic growth, and they're going to impact prices. And so the chart on the right-hand side comes from the OECD, and this is their projection. And this matches up with a lot of other projections that are out there in the marketplace now from various different economists on what economic growth in the US looks like before the tariffs were announced relative to after. And so the orange line is the pre-tariff outlook. The blue line at bottom is the most current outlook or baseline forecast after these tariffs were announced. And then that middle line is an outlook with a lighter tariff scenario. So one in which we end up with some negotiation, which leads to tariff rates being somewhat lower than what were expected when this forecast was made. And so I think the numbers here and what they're saying, the gaps are less important than the concept. And the fact is that under this tariff scenario, whatever the regime ends up being, we can expect that economic growth is going to be slower, in particular in 25 and 2026. And so economists are projecting anywhere between 0.5% being shaved off of economic growth in those 2 years, 25 and 26, to a full percentage point. So going back to employment, I thought it'd be important to take a look at kind of a few labor force statistics. And one is the unemployment rate. I talked about the fact that we've been growing employment year over year since the pandemic. but that trend has been coming down, right? And so what you can see on the left-hand side is the rate of the unemployment rate in the US. You can see that that bottomed somewhere around early to mid 2023. So we were at 3.5%. It looks like in the first quarter of 23. I think one of these months we actually had a reading of 3.4%, which is extremely low. Economists basically say about 4.5 to 5% as an unemployment rate is full employment, because there's always some sort of churn in the labor force. And so to see 3.4, 3.5%, extremely low. We had not seen those sorts of rates since the late 1960s. And so since then, we've seen those rates tick up, but a lot of that is because we've seen people return to the labor force. And so in those couple of years following the pandemic, we saw a lot of people leaving the workforce. We saw baby boomers and those on the edge of retirement leaving the workforce, but we also saw younger workers, those what we call prime age workers, actually leaving the workforce. And the good news is we've seen those prime age workers, those aged 25 to 55, return to the workforce. And so that's raised the base. And so that's why you see this creep up. Even though we were adding jobs over this period, we've seen the unemployment rate creep up just a little bit. But one thing I want to point out is what we see in this chart on the right-hand side. This is the participation, the labor force participation rate. And you can see here that we've looked at the trend of this rate going back to 2019. And you can see we've got an old normal. This is the pre-pandemic normal. And we've got now what we call a new normal of labor force participation after the pandemic. And that is about not the prime force workers, those 25 to 55. Those workers, as I mentioned, have rejoined the workforce. But who has not rejoined the workforce are those nearing retirement, those 55 plus. So those between 55 and 65, we have seen since the pandemic have not returned to the workforce, many of them, and many of them won't, right? Just for demographic reasons, for financial reasons, they're ready to retire. There's a lot of people that said with the pandemic, I'm going to leave work for a while. Maybe it's going to be temporary, maybe it's not. And a lot of those are going to turn into more permanent retirements. So I think moving forward, and we'll talk about labor force here in a few minutes, we expect that, especially among those older workers, there are going to be few of them within the workforce over the next few years.
And John, this, we obviously studied a lot of this in our workforce study that we shared some initial highlights at the fall conference. The full report is probably going to be released next week. It's just going through final design. But a lot of these come out in that report, as well as what the future of that looks like. We do have a question related to labor, John, if I may. And so they're saying, basically the labor market has been fierce, is their words. Salaries have been high, right? We've seen that steady increase in salaries and the pressures on those costs. Where do you see the cost of labor going, and will it impact the delivery of projects moving forward? I don't know if maybe that's part of your forecasting forward section, but I just thought I'd bring it up now.
Yes, stay tuned. Great
Stay
question.
tuned. Okay.
We'll get into that. We do have some data and some information and some insights to share coming up as we look through the outlook. So that's employment. Let's take a look. This is the last thing I want to talk about in terms of the macroeconomic environment, and that's pricing. And where we are on this battle with inflation. In this sort of this feeds into the question, Daphne, about wages, right? And inflation obviously is pushed into everything, goods and services that we buy. And as goods and services go up, necessarily wages go up as well. And so this generalized inflation rate that we see puts upward pressure on wages as well. You can see the chart on the left breaks out core services CPI, so this is the consumer price index on services, and core goods CPI, so consumer prices on goods. And what's very clear here is that we saw the spike in both of these things, goods and services, but in particular goods coming out of the pandemic. You can see that big spike. Services was a bit of a slower ramp up, and this goes to the wage issue, right? Because as goods start to rise and there's more pressure, that starts to put upward pressure on wages. And then those services prices, so engineering obviously being a service-oriented industry, as wages go up, those services prices also must rise as some of those wages start to get passed through. And so the good news is, while we've seen goods and services prices go up very quickly, we've seen them come down rapidly as well. Goods a little bit more rapidly than services because of the wage impact. Services inflation tends to be a little bit more sticky than goods inflation. But we have seen progress, and that progress has come as the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates. By raising rates, that's helped to cool the economy a little bit and take some of that upward pressure out of inflation. And it's worked. You've seen over the last couple of years, inflation has come down. But if you look to the end of these trend lines, what is very clear is that we're starting to see inflation pick back up, right? And so the pandemic was initially, and a lot of the supply chain issues that we had following the pandemic, that was really the vector that pushed inflation through in 2021, 22, and 23. We saw it normalize in late 23 and into 24. And now in 25, the new vector that we're seeing that's lifting prices, it's what's happening with trade policy and with tariffs. And so obviously, when we put tariffs on goods coming into the US, a lot of those prices that are put on those producers are passed through to either manufacturers or other companies that are using those raw materials, or ultimately to end consumers. And so that is going to raise price levels. Those higher price levels can be a challenge in terms of monetary policy, right? And monetary policy, extremely important for the US economy and extremely important for the engineering and design services industry, right? We all know interest rates have been on the rise, and that's been a headwind to construction. And as a headwind to construction, it's obviously a headwind to the engineering industry. And so we want to see those rates normalize, right? We're at a point where interest rates are still restrictive. We'd like to get them down to a neutral rate, or even one that is going to be supportive of construction activity and of engineering and design services activity. And so the good news is, you can see on the right that federal funds rate has been coming down. We had one rate cut so far this year. The Federal Reserve meets next week. It is overwhelmingly expected that we're going to see another rate cut next week, and we're probably going to see one more in December, right? And so, but this inflation issue is complicating things. The uncertainty that we have around tariffs and trade policy is putting the Federal Reserve Bank in a tricky position, because they've got to kind of wait and see. A lot of the transmission of prices from tariffs is going to take some time. And so what the Federal Reserve doesn't want to do is cut interest rates too quickly and start to spur inflation, where we see the spikes that we saw back in 22 and 23. And further complicating that challenge, we've got a government shutdown and we're not getting a lot of data, right? We're going to get a read on inflation tomorrow, last month's inflation that was supposed to be released last week. So fortunately, they said, you know what, you guys at the BLS and the BEA, maybe you come into the office this week, crunch some numbers, and tell us exactly where inflation is. So the Federal Reserve knows how to act next week. And so tomorrow we'll get a read on inflation. We're expecting that inflation has again risen. We're thinking about we're going to see about 3% inflation when that number gets released tomorrow. Okay, so that is your quick primer on what's happening in the macroeconomic environment. Let's turn our attention now to the engineering and design services industry, in particular, what performance has looked like over the recent past. And so I want to start by looking at revenue in the engineering and design services industry. And so this chart shows us the longer term trend. So the bars represent how much revenue the industry generated year by year. And the line in this chart is the growth rate, the annual growth rate for each of these years. And so if you fast forward all the way to the right-hand side of the chart here, you can see that last year, $459 billion in revenue was generated across the industry. That represents 5.3% growth over 2023 levels. So another really strong year overall for the industry. You can see this growth rate is coming down somewhat. We saw those record-breaking growth rates in 21 and 22. We're at double-digit growth. As I mentioned, coming out of the pandemic, we saw the economy growing very quickly, and the engineering design services industry grew even quicker over that period in time. But we are seeing things normalize. As I mentioned, interest rates have been elevated. That has really led to or acted as a headwind rather to construction activity, especially in specific end markets. I'll talk about some of those end markets here in a couple of minutes. But yeah, we are seeing a strong environment for the industry in 2024, leading into 2025, but we do see moderation. We have seen about 35% growth since that cyclical bottom in 2020, and about 26% growth since the last cyclical high in 2019. So it's been a really strong period for the industry over the last 4 to 5 years. So with industry revenues up, as you might expect, a lot of the other economic metrics that we follow with respect to the industry were up in 2024 as well. You can see the direct jobs that were supported by the industry up 2.6% to 1.7 million jobs. The total number of establishments, this is essentially the number of engineering and design services offices in the US, was up 3.6% last year to almost 173,000 offices. The average wage, so as we talked about, Daphne, we see upward pressure on wages. Those wages were up 5%. And so that delta or difference between what we're seeing in wage growth and revenue growth is starting to narrow, right? And so when we see revenues up by 5.3%, but wages up by 5%, obviously engineering design services for firms, very labor intensive. And so a lot of this pressure on wages is putting pressure on firms' bottom lines in 2024 as revenue growth slows, but we're not really seeing wage growth slowing at the same rate. The economic contribution of the industry was $262 billion last year, up 4.4%. And then the total tax collections were up 3.1% to $139 billion last year. So another component of this study that we conduct each year is looking at the economic contribution of the engineering and design services industry. So we're obviously measuring performance in the industry, we're doing our forecast of the industry, but we're also looking at how the industry spills over into other economic sectors around the US, right? And so That $459 billion in industry revenue I just mentioned, that was a 5% increase over the previous year. That actually translates into a broader economic contribution of $685 billion in total economic contribution. And we'll look at in a minute some of the other industry sectors and how exactly the engineering and design services industry interacts with some of these other industries. But suffice it to say, there is this multiplier effect. So through the supply chain, through wages that are paid, through all of the industry workers that get respent in the US economy. And that multiplier effect means that for every dollar that is generated in industry revenue, we see about $1.50 added to US GDP. You can see here on the right-hand side how that breaks out. So we had $262 billion in direct industry GDP. That is the dollars that actually stay within the engineering and design services industry. And we had another $423 billion in indirect and induced GDP. That is the impact of those dollars that go to the supply chain of the engineering industry, as well as those respent wages that I talked about.
John, we on the previous slide, well, even on this slide too, you have the industry revenue. So the 4.59, or I'm sorry, $459 billion in industry revenue. And I know we have a proprietary model that you've developed for us that helps us get to these numbers. But there's a question from the audience about, kind of what is the source that you're using to get to those revenue totals?
Yeah, so all of the numbers in terms of the historical data, Daphne, so great question. All of the numbers are publicly reported data. So everything is derived off of data that is reported by various different US reporting agencies. So the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Census Bureau. Those agencies don't go down to quite the detail that we measure in our study and our analysis. And so we do a little bit of modeling work to be able to estimate some of those using other data sources. But we're basically triangulating a lot of data that comes from publicly available sources. So a lot of this data is replicatable and measurable and can be tracked back to all of these US sources. So good question.
Thanks, John.
And then when it comes to the economic impact analysis, we use a non-proprietary model that comes from a company called Implan. Implan is really the de facto standard for doing economic impact analysis in the US. And so economic shops, economic development agencies around the country are using Implan to help model economic impacts everywhere. And that's based on BEA data as well as that data and these models that Implan has built. And so that's what we use to translate that revenue into the economic impact figures that we share in the report. So one of the things that we look at obviously is the fiscal impact. So taxes. I won't spend a lot of time here, going through the detail of this. But what you can see here is that we break out with the help of Implan and being able to model that industry revenue, how that shakes out in terms of the tax impact or fiscal impact of the industry. And so $140 billion in tax revenues, at the federal, state, and local levels was generated based on that $459 billion in industry revenue. And so you can look at this a couple of ways. You look at it and say, wow, $140 billion, as an industry, we're getting taxed a lot, right? This is 30% essentially of revenues are going to various different tax coffers, right? And so that's a way you can look at it. And so there is a negative connotation there, but on the positive side of the ledger, it is about the economic contribution that you all make as companies and as an industry to the US economy. And I think particularly now, in today's political environment, it's as important as ever to talk about your impact and what you mean to the US economy. And it's really important because of the wages that you pay. The average wage in the engineering and design services industry is about 50% higher than the national average. And so that doesn't just mean that your employees at your companies are earning more, but it also means they're spending more, and those dollars are reverberating faster through the US economy. And so given that higher wage impact, you have an outsized economic impact on the US economy. When we look at how that economic impact breaks out across various different industries of the US economy, you can see, there's some interesting things to kind of point out here. And so a lot of numbers on this slide. Don't want to get into the weeds of the individual impacts, but what you can see on this table is the number of jobs that are supported across these different US industries because the engineering and design services industry exists, because of that $459 billion in revenue that you all generated last year. And so you can see these jobs are broken out into a couple of different columns. You've got direct jobs, indirect jobs, and induced jobs. So the direct jobs, very simple to understand. These are the jobs that are supported directly by the engineering and design services industry. So this is the 1.7 million jobs I talked about. These are the employees directly employed at your firms. The indirect jobs represent the jobs along the supply chain of the engineering industry, right? And so you can see an additional 1.5 million jobs supported along the supply chain. And if you look at some of the categories with big numbers here, it makes sense. You look at indirect, professional, scientific, and technical services. That is where engineering itself lies, but it's also where a lot of your supply chain lies. So think about any of your technology providers are going to be supported in this industry. If you're paying for accounting services, they're going to be supported in this industry. If you look at the next industry on the list, administrative services, this is all clerical and staffing and travel. All of these jobs along the supply chain are supported by your industry. And then in the induced column, you can see that's a big number, 2.5 million jobs supported by the industry in terms of induced impacts. And this goes back to what I was talking about with the wage impacts, right? So paying that wage, those wages get respent in local economies on the goods and services that we all spend on in our local economies. And so if you look at some of these sectors as an example, health and social services, which is third on the list, obviously zero direct impact, a very small indirect impact or supply chain impact, but a large induced impact. And so that is, your employees that get paid a wage and then they re-spend on healthcare in their local communities. And so that leads to a large economic impact. So your 1.7 million in direct jobs leads to, when all is said and done, about 5.7 million in total jobs that are supported by the industry in the US economy. We also look at this, the economic impact as well as the revenue generated by the industry, by region and by state. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time really digging into the states or the regions. I wanted to kind of give you some high-level trends here. But if you haven't already, we'll give you access to the report at the end of the session. Take a look at the data that's in the report. We break out every state in the country in terms of revenue generated and the economic impact. So the jobs that are supported, the wages that are paid. And so you can look and see where you operate your business, which states you operate, and how those states are performing relative to the rest of the US. But just quickly here, looking at some of the regional aspects, you can see here the largest regions in terms of total revenue generated. At the top of the list, the South Atlantic region and the Pacific region. Just those two regions alone comprised nearly 40% of industry revenues in 2024. The fastest growing region was the Mountain region in 2024, followed by the South Atlantic and the West North Central regions, as well as East South Central. We continue to see a lot of growth in the South, in the Mountain states. That has been a trend that we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years. We expect the next 10 to 15 years to look very much the same. We think the Mountain region is going to be the fastest growing when we look at, expectations for population growth and construction growth, followed by the South Atlantic and the West South Central. So really, again, the southern regions and then the Mountain region going to be leading the charge over the next few years.
I was just going to add, John, to your point about all the state data being in the report, in the back, in the appendix, are all of those charts. We are also creating for all of our state member organization executives a state sheet, if you will, that will show all of this data in a nice designed format. So those are being developed as we speak, and will be going out to our MO executives in the coming week.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Daphne. Yeah, and so when you're looking at those numbers and you're thinking about where you operate in the states that you operate in, and then again thinking about economic impact and why it's important to communicate from an advocacy perspective, because you are such a labor-intensive industry and a lot of your economic impact is driven by those wage impacts. That means a lot of those dollars also stay local, right? And so if your business is operating in North Carolina and you're doing a lot of work in North Carolina, you're really adding to not a lot of those dollars are leaking out of the economy. So other businesses like manufacturing, where you have a big supply chain and you're purchasing from all over the place. No, you're operating your businesses in that state or in those regions. You're paying your workers, your employees a wage, and those wages are getting respent in your local economies. And so there's a lot that you can say about what you mean, not just from a national level, but how important you are from an economic impact perspective at a state or regional level. And then just the last thing I wanted to take a look at, in terms of state or regional revenue that's generated that I thought was very interesting. We had pulled this together last year looking at IIJA funding. And Daphne, we looked at kind of how those dollars were getting allocated on a state-by-state basis. And if some of you were on this call last year or at Fall Conference, you might have heard us talking about how we saw a lot of winners and losers in terms of state allocation for those IIJA funds. And I thought it was interesting when we looked at the data this year, we've seen a catch up, and we thought we would, we just didn't know that it would be so quick. And so I think the good news here is we're seeing a much more even funding in terms of those allocations, right? And so if you look at this, you can see a lot of the states here are that sort of dark forest green color. And this is looking at those IIJ funds on a per capita basis. And so we're seeing a lot of consistency in the way those dollars are flowing to states. A couple of outliers here when you look at the map, but by and large, we're seeing much more even distribution than what we saw.
Did we lose John? You're muted, Daphne.
There we go. He's back, but we lost your presentation, John.
Sorry about that. What happened there? Let's get that back up. Okay, are we back?
We are back. Thank
Okay,
you.
sorry. So I don't know where I dropped off, but I think we had gone through state IIJA numbers. So
Yep.
just talking about, nationally, I think it's important to note how the rollout has looked. And so 70% of those IIJA funds currently are binding, but only 40% of funds have been dispersed. And so I think this really speaks to the longer runway that we expect to see as those funds continue to roll out. We're already, I guess, 4 to 5 years into since IIJA was passed, but we are nowhere near the end of the runway in terms of those funds hitting the marketplace. In fact, when we look at transportation funds that are broken out here on the right-hand side, we're even further behind. Only $170 billion of the $673 billion in transportation funds have actually been dispersed. So about 25% of those funds. All right, so let's look forward here. And talk about how we see the industry performing over the next few years. And so just want to start by looking at our top line forecast for revenue. This again is looking at revenue, annual revenue over time. You can see the blue bars represent historical revenue, that $459 billion you can see in 2024. The darker colored bars are our forecast. And what you can see here is that clearly we expect the moderation to continue when we look at 2025 and 2026. The orange line shows us the growth rate, the annual growth rate in those revenues. And so we expect further deceleration in growth in 2025. At the bottom, you can see the actual growth rates in both nominal and real terms. So the nominal output growth shows us the growth that includes inflation. Real output growth strips out the impact and adjusts those growth rates for expected inflation over those periods. And so you can see that we expect continued moderation in 2025. I think the good news here is that you can see a reacceleration through the forecast horizon, but we do expect somewhat slower growth over the next few years. And I think a lot of that is due to the headwinds that we are seeing in terms of the interest rate environment, and then the uncertainty that we currently have in terms of trade policy and tariffs. So taking a look at some of the end markets and our expectations within each of those end markets, what you can see here on this chart is a breakout in terms of construction put in place in each of the various different end markets that are on this slide. The size of the bubble on this chart represents the size of that market in terms of construction put in place. Where that market sits on this slide from left to right is how fast that market grew last year in 2024. How high that market sits from top to bottom on the vertical axis is how fast we expect that end market to grow in terms of construction put in place over the next 5 years. And so you can see here that the IIJA markets still expected, these were the faster growing markets last year. We expect those, as I mentioned, that runway of funds far from being exhausted. We expect that to continue to roll out and impact those end markets over the next few years. So you can see like sewage and waste disposal, water supply, transportation, all going to be are going to outperform over the next few years. Manufacturing, you can see, had a tremendous amount of growth last year. Obviously, a lot of dollars have been pushed into onshoring of U.S. manufacturing. We do expect that, ironically, tariffs are likely to grow, are likely to slow growth in manufacturing over the next few years. We think as interest rates come down, some of the more cyclical end markets will start to pick up again. So lodging, commercial, multifamily, and office will start to get somewhat of a pickup. But the fastest growing end market is actually not broken out on its own here, and that's data center, which is embedded in office. And so that's one of the reasons that you see, the expectation so high for office is that data center is included here. If we were to break data center out on its own, it would be somewhere in that far right quadrant. It's going to be way up in the right-hand quadrant, dwarfing all of these other end markets that are on the slide here.
And following along with that, the power and the water to drive all the data centers, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, so we need a big updating, as I think we all know, of the energy grid to be able to support that data center. We're seeing something like, depending on estimates, $800 billion being spent on AI on an annual basis right now. And we don't have the grid that can power all of that AI. And so we expect big updates to the grid over the coming years. And so I actually think I was a little bit surprised that power wasn't even higher here, Daphne, thinking, I think the expectation should be that for years and years to come, we're going to see a lot of dollars pouring into construction to support the power grid.
Yeah.
Just talk briefly about some of the construction headwinds that we see in the marketplace, and this also is a reason that we expect a bit of a slowdown in the engineering space over the next few years. I think when we think about tariffs and trade policy, given that engineering and design services is a service-oriented industry, there's less direct impact to the industry, but obviously a huge indirect impact as the construction industry that is really, 40 to 60% of costs among construction firms are from input costs and building materials, right? And so a lot of those building materials and inputs are being sourced internationally. As we all know, aluminum, steel, lumber, all being tariffed disproportionately. You can see on the right-hand side what we've seen in terms of the uptick over the last couple of months in construction materials. The chart on the left shows Yale Budget Lab conducted a study to look at how various different sectors will be hit in terms of their growth by tariffs. And you can see construction expected to be hit harder than any other industry over the next couple of years. So depending on how trade policy shakes out and what tariff rates look like over the next couple of years, that is likely to be a headwind to the construction industry. Another thing that we keep a close eye on is the labor market. And so we had the question earlier, Daphne, about the labor market and wages and what the impact of that was last year. But more importantly, I think for all of us planning over the next couple of years is what is that going to look like in 2026 and 2027? There's a couple of things that we follow to help us anticipate where we think wages are going. And one is this chart on the left that comes from the BLS that looks at hires versus openings. And so this is for all professional and business services. When we look at this data specifically for engineering, we see the same trends, but they're even more exacerbated. And so what this shows is the ratio of hires versus job openings. And when we have a healthy economy, you can see back in 2019, prior to the pandemic, these two things move in lockstep. And so you can see the ratio in 2019 of job openings to hires was about 1.1, right? And so a company has an opening, they make a hire, they have an opening, they make a hire, those things move more or less in lockstep. But you can see that that gap really widened coming out of the pandemic. We got all the way up to, in 2022, a ratio of 1.7 job openings per hire. So firms wanted to hire, but they couldn't. And so it's a story that I'm sure sounds very familiar to a lot of you on this call. Very challenging labor market. The supply of labor just has not been there. As we've seen things start to slow, I've talked about that slowing growth rate in engineering and design services revenue. We've seen demand for labor slow a little bit. And so that has helped to relieve this trend somewhat. And so that's what you can see in 24 and 25, where this gap starts to narrow. And so now in 2025, we're back to a ratio of about 1.2, 1.3. And so we're not quite into healthy labor market territory, but we are looking better. You can see that wages have continued to grow. That growth has accelerated through 2024. We do think there will be a little bit of that pressure relieved this year and into next year as things start to slow from the demand side. What we don't see, however, slowing are the supply challenges in terms of the labor force. And we don't have a ton of time to get into this today, but Daphne mentioned the workforce, the Firm of the Future study, a lot of really great data there. Suffice it to say, we've got a lot of challenges to face as an industry in terms of demographics and how to solve for labor force. So I will share these slides. It talks a little bit about the fact that we have a lot of engineers retiring, not enough coming into the workforce through our colleges and universities. And I know Daphne has a lot more information to share from the Firm of the Future study. One of the ways, and again, I think there's a lot more data in the Firm of the Future study that we can think about solving this problem, is through increasing the productivity that we see in the industry, right? And so I think AI holds a lot of promise there, promise that has yet to be delivered, right? And so we're very much in the early innings of understanding what AI can really mean to support our businesses and our workflows, how it's going to change our workforces, how it's going to add to productivity. If you look at the chart on the right-hand side, this shows productivity in the engineering services industry relative to all U.S. industries. And what you can see very clearly here is that the engineering services industry has lagged. We have grown productivity in the industry over the last 10 years or so at half the rate of overall U.S. productivity growth. And so if AI, other technologies can help to unlock, even a little bit of additional productivity, that can be the next leg higher. That can help support, with even given the labor force challenges that we see, that can help support, the next wave of growth that we can see in the industry over the next few years. Okay, so just very quickly summarizing a few things that we have our eye on moving forward. I mentioned policy uncertainty. That's number one on the list, really looking at what is going to happen with trade policy and tariffs. I mean, until we have that certainty to be able to act, we're not going to be able to fully unlock growth within the industry. We're keeping a close eye on debt levels, national debt levels, as well as corporate debt levels. We see this as potentially being a big risk, macroeconomic risk we're keeping an eye on. Persistent inflation. I talked about the fact that we saw spikes in inflation coming out of the pandemic. We've seen things normalize, but now we have this uptick because of where we are with trade policy. That is going to impact monetary policy. Let's hope that we can see cooler inflation levels. We can see a more certain trade policy that allows the Federal Reserve to continue to normalize interest rates, which can get construction going again and can help support engineering growth over the next couple of years. And then kind of bigger picture, just looking at where we go with AI and technology and how that's going to change labor markets over the next few years. Okay, so I know we're a little bit over time. I'll toss it to you, Daphne. I don't know if we have some questions here
I
that.
have one more quick question that came in back when you were talking about IIJA, John. Is the revenue growth and insurance and the issuance of IIJA funds in blue states impacted by the current federal administration?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, if I was going to give an answer, I'd only be speculating. I don't really know. You know, we haven't seen that necessarily in the data, you know, at a macro level. So unfortunately, you could suspect that maybe there's some politics getting played. I mean, certainly there's politics being played everywhere, and so why wouldn't that be another lever? But you know, we don't see anything specifically in the data where I can see that is clearly happening now.
Okay. If you'll go ahead and flip to the next slide, John, this is the QR code for anyone who hasn't yet downloaded the full report. As we talked about earlier, there is a lot of data in here, all the state level data that might be of interest to you, but even a lot more data than we were certainly able to cover in this hour. So we hope you will download that and have a look. And of course, we want to thank our donors who make all of this research possible. We would not be able to do any of this without them. I know many of you are on the call today, so thank you for what you do to support the Institute and the work that we're doing. We hope you found this valuable. We will be sending an evaluation to you all shortly, and also copies of the slides. We do have another session coming up. We talked a lot, John and I, back and forth about the workforce study, and we actually have a session coming up next Tuesday on the 28th at 12:30 Eastern. We're going to be talking to several young professionals from within your firms about what they're looking for from their employers. And so this is a piece of follow-on from the workforce study. There's also the AI study that was released in May. You can get that on our website. So please go to the website, download the reports of interest to you, and we hope to see you all next week on our next Future of Engineering Roundtable. Until then, I hope you stay well and safe. Thanks, John.
Thanks, everyone.